The old man gave José Arcadio Buendía a drink of a gentle colour, and the light went on in his memory. His eyes became moist from weeping even before he noticed himself in an absurd living room, where objects were labelled, and before he was ashamed of the solemn nonsense written on the walls, and even before he recognized the newcomer with a dazzling glow of joy. It was Melquiades. While Macondo was celebrating the recovery of its memory, José Arcadio Buendía and Melquiades dusted off their old friendship. The gypsy was inclined to stay in the town. He really had been through death, but he had returned because he could not bear the solitude. Repudiated by his tribe, having lost all of his supernatural faculties because of his faithfulness to life, he decided to take refuge in that corner of the world which had still not been discovered by death, dedicated to the operation of a daguerreotype laboratory. José Arcadio Buendía had never heard of that invention. But when he saw himself and his whole family fastened onto a sheet of iridescent metal for an eternity, he was mute with stupefaction. That was the date of the oxidized daguerreotype in which José Arcadio Buendía appeared with his bristly and greying hair, his cardboard collar attached to his shirt by a copper button, and an expression of startled solemnity, whom Ursula described, dying with laughter, as a frightened general. José Arcadio Buendía was, in fact, frightened on that clear December morning when the daguerreotype was made, for he was thinking that people were slowly wearing away, while his image would endure on a metallic plaque. Through a curious reversal of custom, it was Ursula who got that idea out of his head, as it was also she who forgot her ancient bitterness, and decided that Melquiades would stay on in the house, although she never permitted them to make a daguerreotype of her, because, according to her very words, she did not want to survive as a laughing-stock for her grandchildren. That morning, she dressed the children in their best clothes, powdered their faces, and gave a spoonful of marrow syrup to each one, so that they would all remain absolutely motionless during the nearly 2 minutes in front of Melquiades's fantastic camera. In the family daguerreotype, the only one that ever existed, Aureliano appeared dressed in black velvet between Amaranta and Rebecca. He had the same languor and same clairvoyant look that he would have years later as he faced the firing squad. But he still had not sensed the premonition of his fate. He was an expert silversmith, praised over all the swampland for the delicacy of his work. In the workshop, which he shared with Melquiades's mad laboratory, he could barely be heard breathing. He seemed to be taking refuge in some other time, while his father and the gypsy, with shouts, interpreted the predictions of Nostradamus amidst a noise of flasks and trays, and the disaster of spilled acids and silver bromide that was lost in the twists and turns it gave at every instant. That dedication to his work, the good judgment with which he directed his attention, had allowed Aureliano to earn in a short time more money than Ursula had with her delicious candy fauna. But everybody thought it strange that he was now a full-grown man and had not known a woman. It was true that he had never had one. Several months later saw the return of Francisco the man, an ancient vagabond who was almost 200 years old, and who frequently passed through Macondo, distributing songs that he composed himself. In them, Francisco the man told in great detail the things that had happened in the towns along his route, from Manaure to the edge of the swamp, so that if anyone had a message to send, or an event to make public, he would pay him 2 cents to include it in his repertory. That was how Ursula learned of the death of her mother, as a simple consequence of listening to the songs, in the hope that they would say something about her son Jose Arcadio. Francisco the man, called that because he had once defeated the devil in a duel of improvisation, and whose real name no one knew, disappeared from Macondo during the insomnia plague, and one night he reappeared suddenly in Caterino's store. The whole town went to listen to him, to find out what had happened in the world. On that occasion, there arrived with him a woman who was so fat that 4 Indians had to carry her in a rocking chair, and an adolescent mulatto girl with a forlorn look who protected her from the sun with an umbrella. Aureliano went to Caterino's store that night. He found Francisco the man, like a monolithic chameleon, sitting in the midst of a circle of bystanders. He was singing the news with his old, out-of-tune voice, accompanying himself with the same archaic accordion that Sir Walter Raleigh had given him in the Guianas, and keeping time with his great walking feet that were cracked from saltpetre. In front of a door at the rear, through which men were going and coming, the matron of the rocking chair was sitting and fanning herself in silence. Caterino, with a felt rose behind his ear, was selling the gathering mugs of fermented cane juice, and he took advantage of the occasion to go over to the men and put his hand on them where he should not have. Towards midnight the heat was unbearable. Aureliano listened to the news to the end without hearing anything that was of interest to his family. He was getting ready to go home when the matron signalled him with her hand. "You go in too," she told him. "It only costs 20 cents. Aureliano threw a coin into the hopper that the matron had in her lap and went into the room without knowing why. The adolescent mulatto girl, with her small bitch's teats, was naked on the bed. Before Aureliano, 63 men had passed through the room that night. From being used too much, kneaded with sweat and sighs, the air in the room had begun to turn to mud. The girl took off the soaked sheet and asked Aureliano to hold it by one side. It was as heavy as a piece of canvas. They squeezed it, twisting it at the ends until it regained its natural weight. They turned over the mat, and the sweat came out of the other side. Aureliano was anxious for that operation never to end. He knew the theoretical mechanics of love, but he could not stay on his feet because of the weakness of his knees, and although he had goose pimples on his burning skin, he could not resist the urgent need to expel the weight of his bowels. When the girl finished fixing up the bed and told him to get undressed, he gave her a confused explanation. "They made me come in. They told me to throw 20 cents into the hopper and hurry up." The girl understood his confusion. "If you throw in 20 cents more when you go out, you can stay a little longer," she said softly. Aureliano got undressed, tormented by shame, unable to get rid of the idea that his nakedness could not stand comparison with that of his brother. In spite of the girl's efforts, he felt more and more indifferent and terribly alone. "I'll throw in another 20 cents, he said with a desolate voice. The girl thanked him in silence. Her back was raw. Her skin was stuck to her ribs, and her breathing was forced because of an immeasurable exhaustion. 2 years before, far away from there, she had fallen asleep without putting out the candle, and had awakened surrounded by flames. The house where she lived with her grandmother, who had raised her, was reduced to ashes. Since then, her grandmother carried her from town to town, putting her to bed for 20 cents in order to make up the value of the burned house. According to the girl's calculations, she still had 10 years of 70 men per night, because she also had to pay the expenses of the trip and food for both of them, as well as pay the Indians who carried the rocking chair. When the matron knocked on the door the second time, Aureliano left the room without having done anything, troubled by a desire to weep. That night he could not sleep, thinking about the girl, with a mixture of desire and pity. He felt an irresistible need to love her and protect her. At dawn, worn out by insomnia and fever, he made the calm decision to marry her in order to free her from the despotism of her grandmother and to enjoy all the nights of satisfaction that she would give the 70 men. But at 10 o'clock in the morning, when he reached Caterino's store, the girl had left town. Time mitigated his mad proposal, but it aggravated his feelings of frustration. He took refuge in work. He resigned himself to being a womanless man for all his life, in order to hide the shame of his uselessness. In the meantime, Melchiades had printed on his plates everything that was printable in Macondo, and he left the daguerreotype laboratory to the fantasies of José Arcadio Buendía, who had resolved to use it to obtain scientific proof of the existence of God. Through a complicated process of superimposed exposures taken in different parts of the house, he was sure that sooner or later he would get a daguerreotype of God, if he existed, or put an end once and for all to the supposition of his existence. Melchiades got deeper into his interpretations of Nostradamus. He would stay up until very late, suffocating in his faded velvet vest, scribbling with his tiny sparrow hands, whose rings had lost the glow of former times. One night he thought he had found a prediction of the future of Macondo. It was to be a luminous city with great glass houses, where there was no trace remaining of the race of the Buendías. "It's a mistake," José Arcadio Buendía thundered. "They won't be houses of glass but of ice, as I dreamed, and there will always be a Buendía, per omnia secula seculorum." Ursula fought to preserve common sense in that extravagant house. Having broadened her business of little candy animals with an oven that went all night turning out baskets and more baskets of bread, and a prodigious variety of puddings, meringues, and cookies, which disappeared in a few hours on the roads winding through the swamp. She had reached an age where she had a right to rest, but she was none the less more and more active. So busy was she in her prosperous enterprises that one afternoon she looked distractedly towards the courtyard while the Indian woman helped her sweeten the dough, and she saw 2 unknown and beautiful adolescent girls doing frame embroidery in the light of the sunset. They were Rebecca and Amaranta. As soon as they had taken off the mourning clothes for their grandmother, which they wore with inflexible rigour for 3 years, their bright clothes seemed to have given them a new place in the world. Rebecca, contrary to what might have been expected, was the more beautiful. She had a light complexion, large and peaceful eyes, and magical hands that seemed to work out the design of the embroidery with invisible threads. Amaranta, the younger, was somewhat graceless, but she had the natural distinction, the inner tightness of her dead grandmother. Next to them, although he was already revealing the physical drive of his father, Arcadio looked like a child. He set about learning the art of silverwork with Aureliano, who had also taught him how to read and write. Ursula suddenly realized that the house had become full of people, that her children were on the point of marrying and having children, and that they would be obliged to scatter for lack of space. Then she took out the money she had accumulated over long years of hard labour, made some arrangements with her customers, and undertook the enlargement of the house. She had a formal parlour for visits built, another one that was more comfortable and cool for daily use, a dining room with a table with 12 places where the family could sit with all of their guests, 9 bedrooms with windows on the courtyard, and a long porch protected from the heat of noon by a rose garden with a railing on which to place pots of ferns and begonias. She had the kitchen enlarged to hold 2 ovens. The granary, where Pilar Ternera had read José Arcadio's future, was torn down, and another twice as large built, so that there would never be a lack of food in the house. She had baths built in the courtyard in the shade of the chestnut tree, one for the women and another for the men, and in the rear a large stable, a fenced-in chicken yard, a shed for the milk cows, and an aviary open to the 4 winds, so that wandering birds could roost there at their pleasure. Followed by dozens of masons and carpenters, as if she had contracted her husband's hallucinating fever, Ursula fixed the position of light and heat and distributed space without the least sense of its limitations. The primitive building of the founders became filled with tools and materials, of workmen exhausted by sweat, who asked everybody please not to molest them, exasperated by the sack of bones that followed them everywhere with its dull rattle. In that discomfort, breathing quicklime and tar, no one could see very well how from the bowels of the earth there was rising not only the largest house in the town, but the most hospitable and cool house that had ever existed in the region of the swamp. José Arcadio Buendía, trying to surprise divine providence in the midst of the cataclysm, was the one who least understood it. The new house was almost finished when Ursula drew him out of his chimerical world in order to inform him that she had an order to paint the front blue and not white as they had wanted. She showed him the official document. José Arcadio Buendía, without understanding what his wife was talking about, deciphered the signature. "Who is this fellow?" he asked. "The magistrate," Ursula answered disconsolately. "They say he's an authority sent by the government." Don Apolinar Moscote, the magistrate, had arrived in Macondo very quietly. He put up at the Hotel Jacob, built by one of the first Arabs who came to swap knickknacks for macaws, and on the following day he rented a small room with a door on the street 2 blocks away from the Buendía house. He set up a table and a chair that he had brought from Jacob, nailed up on the wall the shield of the Republic that he had brought with him, and on the door he painted the sign Magistrate. His first order was for all the houses to be painted blue in celebration of the anniversary of national independence. José Arcadio Buendía, with the copy of the order in his hand, found him taking his nap in a hammock he had set up in the narrow office. "Did you write this paper?" he asked him. Don Apolinar Moscote, a mature man, timid, with a ruddy complexion, said yes. "By what right?" José Arcadio Buendía asked again. Don Apolinar Moscote picked up a paper from the drawer of the table and showed it to him. "I have been named magistrate of this town." José Arcadio Buendía did not even look at the appointment. "In this town we do not give orders with pieces of paper," he said without losing his calm. "And so that you know it once and for all, we don't need any judges here, because there's nothing that needs judging." Facing Don Apolinar Moscote, still without raising his voice, he gave a detailed account of how they had founded the village, of how they had distributed the land, opened the roads, and introduced the improvements that necessity required, without having bothered the government, and without anyone having bothered them. "We are so peaceful that none of us has died even of a natural death," he said. "You can see that we still don't have any cemetery." No one was upset that the government had not helped them. On the contrary, they were happy that up until then it had let them grow in peace, and he hoped that it would continue leaving them that way, because they had not founded a town so that the first upstart who came along would tell them what to do. Don Apolinar had put on his denim jacket, white like his trousers, without losing at any moment the elegance of his gestures. "So that if you want to stay here like any other ordinary citizen, you're quite welcome," José Arcadio Buendía concluded. "But if you've come to cause disorder by making the people paint their houses blue, you can pick up your junk and go back where you came from, because my house is going to be white, like a dove."